Well, hey everybody, Pastor Steve here. Today in our Bible reading plan for our devotion, we are in Jeremiah chapter 6. You'll remember that Jeremiah was a prophet in the latter part of the 600s and the beginnings of the 500s BC, a prophet just before the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, during the destruction, and then for a few years after the destruction. And he preached to the people of the southern kingdom of Judea and Jerusalem, and to other nations at times as well. The verse that spoke to me in this chapter is verse 3, where he says, "Shepherds and their flocks will come to her. They will pitch their tents around her, and they will pasture each in his place." He's describing what will happen to Jerusalem and the surrounding area of that city after the Babylonian conquest, after Jerusalem is destroyed. Shepherds will, in the vicinity of that city, shepherds will watch their flocks. It'll be pasture land. It won't be a big city anymore. And it's a vivid picture of the just total devastation that the Babylonians brought to the city of Jerusalem in 587, 586 BC when they besieged it and burned the city, burned the temple, and knocked down the city walls, if you will. And it's just the after effects, if you will, the after effects of God's judgment. Now, he mentions in verse 1 that the evil that's going to come on Jerusalem comes from the north. And if you know geography, Babylon is not from the north. Babylon is over to the east and a little bit south. Basically, southern Iraq today is where Babylon's capital was located. But the reason he says from the north is between Babylon and Judea, or Jerusalem, is desert. So they followed the route of what's called in history the Fertile Crescent. They would go north up toward Nineveh and over to the west, and then down. From the north, they would travel south then into Samaria and into Judea. So they did come from the north. And so there's this vivid description of the affliction that Babylon will bring from the north on Jerusalem. We know from archaeological digs and so on that during the 70 years of captivity while the Jewish exiles were in Babylon, there was very little activity around the city of Jerusalem. We know that from archaeology. There were populations of Jewish people in other places in Judea because Nebuchadnezzar left the poor people there to till the land. But the city of Jerusalem, both biblically and archaeologically, not much happened during those 70 years. And Judah's sins, the people's sins, are described again in this chapter. And sometimes we miss the point when we think that the only thing they did wrong was worship idols. That was at the heart of their sin because it was their idolatry that led to the other sins. When they were worshiping all these other pagan religions, when they weren't putting God first in their life, they weren't being repentant of their sin, then that opened the door to all these other things. They weren't obeying God. But in Jeremiah 6, he points out many of the other sins. At the end of verse 6, talking about the city of Jerusalem, in whose midst there is only oppression. They were oppressing those who were weak and vulnerable. Look at verse 7. In the middle of the verse, he talks about violence and destruction are heard in her. It was a very violent time. In verse 10, they reject God's word and won't listen. In verse 13, they were greedy for gain, materialistic. In verses 13 and 14, there were false prophets teaching things other than what God said. And boy, that's today. In verse 15, they did not even know how to blush, no modesty. Isn't that modern America today? Verse 19, they would not listen to God's word. In verse 28, this one may surprise you. In verse 28, one of the sins for which God judged them was they were going about as a talebearer, as someone who gossiped and slandered. So think about this. This idol worship and not putting God first led to all these other sins, and it was all these other sins combined with their idol worship that led God to destroy the nation in judgment. We sometimes think God doesn't care about gossip and talebearers, slander. He does. God cares about materialism, violence and destruction, lack of modesty, greed, oppression, all of that stuff. To live righteously means to live different than the culture. Not just in big ways, but even in the small ways. And America needs a revival in all of this. But that's never going to come if in the church we don't begin realizing that the small things matter to God as well as the big things. And then we obey Him in the small things, not just the big things. And that's the word for today. I'll see you tomorrow.